Archaeologists are interested in studying how people lived in the past. Most of the time, when we conduct research, we're asking questions about the very material dimensions of life, like what kinds of tools the people used, how they made the things they needed, what kinds of foods they ate, or even how they built their homes and towns. But just as important as these material aspects of life are the non-material things. What were people thinking about? What things did they think were important? How did they believe the world was put together, and why did they believe it was that way? These aspects of life in the past are much harder for archaeologists to get at. Ideas don't leave behind obvious material remains for archaeologists to find. So, how can we know what other people are thinking about? If the people in question are still around, you just ask them. That's what sociocultural anthropologists do, like Napoleon Chagnon, seen here with the Yanomamo tribesmen whose culture he studies. But if you're an archaeologist studying a past society like the Mississippians, you can't interview your subjects because they lived centuries or even millennia ago. Some ancient societies were literate, like the ancient Jews who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. In that case, we can't talk to the people, but we can read what they wrote down. And since people write about things they feel are important, that's the next best thing to asking them directly. Unfortunately, the Mississippians weren't literate either. How can we know what they were thinking? Luckily, archaeologists have recovered a lot of Native American art. Art is like written records in some ways. It's the product of conscious decisions made by the artists. What ideas were important enough to depict? How could the artists give those ideas physical form? If we can understand the artwork of prehistoric Native Americans, we can begin to understand their beliefs and ideas. First, though, we need to find the right kind of art. Some art, like this decorated jar from Moundville, Alabama, is artistic, but it doesn't seem to mean anything in particular. The design is decorative and aesthetic, but it would be difficult to argue that there's a more complex meaning than that. To get inside the minds of ancient artists, we need art that has such a complex meaning. We need iconography. Iconography is even more like written language than art in general. A written sentence like, "The dog chased the cat," has a meaning. That meaning comes from combining the meanings of each individual word in the sentence. But we can take one word out of the sentence, say dog, and it still has the same meaning. If we put that word into a new sentence, it retains its own meaning, even though the sentence as a whole means something new. A work of art is very similar to a sentence. The image as a whole has a meaning. House. But that meaning is the result of combining the meanings of individual parts of the image, like window and door. Those parts of the whole image that have their own meanings are called motifs. Motifs are a lot like words. Let's look more closely at the motif door. If we make some allowances for the particular style of this drawing, the door motif is a rectangle with a small circle along one side. If we see the same shapes in another image, we recognize the meaning door. The motif retains its meaning regardless of the image it is in, and the meaning of the image as a whole depends on the meanings of the motifs in it. At this point, you should be asking, how can we use any of this to learn what people were thinking about in the past? In theory, it should be simple. We identify motifs in the ancient iconography and what they mean. Then we use the motifs that we understand to construct the meanings of entire works of art. Since art is a way of the artist expressing his or her thoughts, that's all there is to it. It is, unfortunately, easier said than done. Let's examine a few motifs from Mississippian artwork and see what we can learn about their meanings. This is a very common motif in Mississippian art. What does it mean? We could stare at this motif all day and come up with 1,000 guesses. Each guess is what scientists call a hypothesis. We want to test the hypotheses to see which one is correct. And we do that by looking for the motif in whole images. This is a thin sheet of copper molded with 4 copies of the motif. This image, unfortunately, does not help us understand the motif. If the motif is like a word whose meaning we don't understand, it doesn't help us to see the word printed out 4 times in a row. We need to see the word in a sentence before we can guess at its meaning. And that means we need an artwork with motifs that we do understand. This engraved shell pendant, also made by Mississippians, has an image that we do understand. It's a warrior, with a war club in his left hand and a trophy head in his right. And the motif in question also appears. Now we have a pretty good idea what the motif means. It's the face painting of a warrior, surrounding his eye. That gives us the common name for the motif, the forked eye surround. Thanks to images like this, we know the meaning of the forked eye surround. It's a warrior's face paint. And we no longer need the entire warrior in the picture. The part can stand for the whole. Therefore, we know that this piece has a meaning associated with warriors. But as is often the case with science, every answer poses another question. If that motif represents a warrior's face paint, why did warriors paint their faces with that particular pattern? What did the pattern mean? To answer that question, let's look for artworks that use the motif but aren't about warriors. This copper plate shows a human head with the face painting, but he is clearly not a warrior. This person has the body of a bird. Perhaps warriors were trying to look like birds. Can we find any images that are clearly just birds, but still have the same markings on their face? Of course we can. This stone pipe also tells us something about the bird itself. This is a raptor, or a hunting bird, with long, sharp talons and a powerful hooked beak. It's not hard to see why warriors would want to look like fierce, predatory raptors. The only question left is, which raptor? One way to answer this question is to look around North America at all the raptors that Mississippian artists would have been familiar with. When you do that, you eventually stumble across the peregrine falcon, sometimes called the duck hawk, whose face clearly has that same forked pattern. So now we know what the motif means. It's the face markings of a warrior. And we know why warriors marked themselves that way, to make themselves look like the fierce, predatory falcon. Here's another common Mississippian motif, a simple geometric pattern. It shows up so often in so many contexts that it must have some particular meaning. But what? Here are a few artifacts showing the motif. The top 2 are both small pendants, about 2 to 3 inches across, and the bottom is a piece of broken pottery, painted with the design. As with the first copper plate above, none of these artifacts help us much in understanding the meaning of the motif, since there are no other, more familiar motifs in the images. This ceramic sherd, however, adds elements that make one interpretation of the motif seem quite obvious. To a modern eye, it certainly looks like a sun, and many archaeologists have suggested that the cross and circle motif represents the sun or the sky world of Mississippian mythology. One way to test this interpretation is to ask. We can't ask the Mississippians themselves, of course, but their Native American descendants are certainly available. When we ask them, though, Some Native Americans disagree that the motif represents the sun. They say it's a medicine wheel, a sacred device representing the 4 cardinal directions. That is, the motif doesn't relate to the sky world, but rather to the middle world, where humans live. On the other hand, it's hard to deny that this looks like the sun. That might not be a problem, however. Motifs can sometimes have more than one meaning, much as words can. After all, the word duck can mean either a water bird or a warning. One final Mississippian motif to make one final point. This one is obviously a hand, but what is that odd marking on it? The motif means something more than just hand, but what? This is the most famous artifact using the motif. This is the rattlesnake disc, an engraved stone disc found at the Mississippian town of Moundville in Alabama. It has the motif, which many call the hand and eye, in the center, surrounded by 2 rattlesnakes. The snakes are tied together with 2 knots, and each has horns. Note that even though the motif is called the hand and eye, here the design doesn't look much like an eye. We also see the fingernails on the hand, which shows that the design is on the back of the hand. This artifact, as aesthetically pleasing as it is, doesn't help illuminate the meaning of the motif. We don't understand the meaning of the whole composition, so we can't use the whole sentence to help us decipher one word. We need more artifacts. Each of these artifacts also has the motif. All were made at or around Moundville as well. The top left is another engraved stone disc, called the Willoughby disc. It has 2 copies of the motif. One is a left hand, and the other a right hand. The top right artifact is an artist's rendering of a copper pendant. Here the fingernails are also visible, so the mark is on the back of the hand. But the ceramic bowl has a line across the bottom of the fingers and no fingernails. This mark is in the palm. Unfortunately, none of these artifacts offers any more help than the rattlesnake disc. So what does the motif mean? We don't know. And that's part of the fun of iconographic analysis. We don't have all the answers yet. But if we continue to look carefully at the evidence we have, and seek out new and more informative artifacts, tomorrow we may find just the right piece that suddenly reveals the meaning, opening up a whole new world of Mississippian ideas. The number of Mississippian artworks we have is astounding. To properly understand the Mississippians' beliefs and ideas, we need to look carefully at their iconography. We must treat it as something more than just a collection of pretty objects, valuable only for their aesthetic qualities. Instead, these are complex messages created by ancient artists who wanted their audiences to understand certain ideas. We are not the intended audience. But if we approach the task systematically and scientifically, paying special attention to the meanings of these beautiful pieces, we can hear the voices of the ancients as loudly as if they were still right here with us.